teams. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're well, and this is my first webinar, so you're going to have to bear with me. I expect that some of you are already working on Agile teams and curious to see what someone else's opinion or experiences are like, and I expect that some of you perhaps will be soon to start on Agile teams and are perhaps looking for some insights into what to expect. So I'm going to try my best to meet both of those needs. And it seems that lately Agile seems to be all the rage for a lot of people. It seems to be the in thing. One of the reasons why I think I was asked to do this particular webinar. And just yesterday I got back from Australia, and it seems that even Australia isn't immune to the Agile Rage at the moment. Even the wallabies and the wildlife are buying in and jumping on the bandwagon, although apparently they've been around a little bit longer than Agile. But today I'm going to touch upon what makes a project Agile, what are the common gotchas for testers particularly, and for people in general working on Agile teams, and I'm going to touch on what role testers play or can play in an Agile team. And one of the first things that people often say to me when we get into a discussion about anything to do with Agile practices is that it's nothing new. Now, I don't know if any of you know what this is a picture of. It's a picture of the Wright Brothers plane. And one of the interesting things about the Wright Brothers was, you probably knew this already, but they were the first people to achieve a powered and controlled flight, in summary at least. Now, the other interesting thing is that they didn't really invent the wing. They didn't invent the engine that powered the aircraft. They didn't invent the concept of controllable flight surfaces, although they did have a patented design for a warping wing design. The aileron, if anyone knows anything about wings, is the part that moves allows the aircraft to roll. Wasn't even invented by them. That was invented later by a guy called Curtis. What was important was that the parts that made the plane weren't new. They'd all been invented before. It's just the Wright brothers happened to combine them in a particular way that just made it work and set the scene for the aviation industry for years to come. There's a lot more detail to that, which I won't go into now, because apparently they actually held the aviation industry back for a while, but that's another story. So equally, in the Agile community, no one actually claims that Agile in itself is anything new. The Agile Alliance itself makes it very clear, in fact, that methodologies gain public attention, and each has a different combination of old ideas, new ideas, and transmuted old ideas. So nobody's trying to claim that it's anything new. So if any of you were thinking that, then let's put that to one side and let's focus on what we came here to talk about today. So what does make a project Agile? Well, let's talk about that for a minute. There's a lot of keywords that people bounce around: test-driven development or test-driven design, extreme programming, Scrum, incremental development, design patterns, unit tests, and so on and so forth, and user stories. And when people talk about Agile development, they often talk about whether or not they're doing all these practices. Now, it's my opinion that doing these practices doesn't necessarily make you Agile. In fact, I would say that you could do all of those practices and perhaps not combine them very well, or not do them very well, or not combine them in the right way for the project that you're working on, and still not and end up not being Agile at all. I think what's behind Agile development is probably more a set of values or a way of thinking about how you build software and how we test software. For example, this is the manifesto for Agile software development. excuse me. Just to the organisers, there's some background noise that's cutting in. I don't know if that's making it difficult for people to hear. Perhaps someone has been unmuted. Okay, that's better. Thank you. What the manifesto for Agile Software Development tries to do is try to establish an understanding between the team who are responsible or on the project and involved in delivering the software, and that includes you, and give them a sort of a way of perceiving how they place value on things. And the key elements of that are the fact that you value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So essentially this means that we're more interested in the skills of the people, we're more interested in the way people interact, giving people the opportunity to interact effectively, rather than people having to follow a particular workflow or use a particular tool. Valuing working software over comprehensive documentation. And by that, I don't know if any of you worked on projects where you just felt like your entire time you were constantly just having to produce documentation and never really getting to spend time testing or building the software that your customers actually wanted you to build, because you had to dot all the I's and cross all the T's and make sure that there was more documentation than software sometimes in the end. I know that I've certainly worked on projects, particularly in heavily regulated industries, where documentation is valued very highly. And sometimes, you know, there are mandated requirements for documentation that has to be produced. But the point is that you produce as much documentation as is required, but your emphasis is on delivering software that works and works well and works in the way that your customers want it to. And another key value is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. I lost count of the amount of projects that I had to work on in the past where the focus would often be on change requests. There would be an agreement on requirements that the customer had to sign up to and we had to sign up to. And over the period of time, those requirements change or evolve, or our understanding of what's required changes and evolves. And then if the customer wants to change anything, they have to go through a long procedure of change requests. And if it was with a software house, potentially renegotiate the contract. And this distracts us from being able to deliver the software that the customer actually needs, the software the customer actually needs today, rather than the software they thought they needed 6 months ago. And an emphasis on responding to change over following a plan. So, you know, valuing that ability to respond to a change, whether it's a change in the requirements due to the climate in the market or changing market conditions, or responding to a change in our understanding of what we wanted. We thought we wanted this, and now we wanted that. And focusing how we develop software and how we test on being able to respond, rather than trying to religiously adhere to a plan. So those are some of the key values that sort of motivated, or rather capture the sort of spirit of Agile software development. And anyone involved in testing, no matter whether you are dedicated as a tester or if you're a developer, all of these statements still hold true. Now, each of the practices and the keywords that you saw on the previous page, these are collections of practices and approaches to building software and testing software that many people have found useful in being able to adhere to this manifesto. And each of them has come from a methodology somewhere. And each of those methodologies essentially, excuse me, each of those methodologies essentially emphasizes some key principles. Close collaboration between the development team and business experts. And I'll come back to the development team in a little while. Face-to-face communication as more efficient than written documentation. The amount of times that I've read a document a few times over and thought I understood it, and I had a conversation with somebody, and suddenly that conversation enlightened me to a whole raft of detail that I just hadn't picked up from documentation. They gave me a new understanding, a depth of understanding about the subject matter that we were dealing with, or that the document was trying to get across. And sometimes that communication can happen in such a short space of time compared to everybody having to sit down and read a document. And that, of course, is facilitated by close collaboration. And one of the key principles is the frequent delivery of new deployable business value. Not frequent delivery of an architectural component that maybe one day when it's integrated with several other things will allow us to deploy something, but actually frequently delivering business value. Some of the methodologies focus on, and in fact most of them focus on the ability to deliver an end-to-end feature, even if it's a very small feature, in every iteration. So you only build as much of the architecture as you actually need to deliver the features that you commit to building in that particular iteration. Another key principle is tight, self-organizing teams. So rather than trying to micromanage everything that everybody does, to rely on the expertise of the people in that team. And for that team to gel and connect with each other and work highly collaboratively, feeling motivated and having high morale are key elements of that key principle. And these methodologies also emphasize ways to craft the code and the team so that the inevitable requirements churn is not crisis. And that's the key part of being able to respond to change. It's no good if each small requirement requires wholesale re-architecture of the application in such a way that that re-architecture is costly. Now, each methodology has a different approach to that. And one methodology I've got the most experience in personally is extreme programming. And something that seems to be happening a lot these days is people aren't trying to religiously adhere to a single methodology necessarily. They might not necessarily just choose Scrum as part of their managing their project. And they might not only choose extreme programming as a way of managing or building the software, or Crystal Clear, or any of the other methodologies. What they tend to do is start with things that they can implement today, that they believe are going to have value, and start picking and choosing from the methodologies as a toolbox. One of the key elements of any Agile methodology is frequent reflection on your experiences so far. So every iteration, say every 2 weeks, for example, being able to reflect back on how things have gone and look at things that you can do to improve or make any symptoms, any problems that you have, make them go away or make them less of an issue. And that reflection is key. We're not here to talk about that. What we're here to talk about is testing. And in projects that do choose Agile approaches, certainly my experience has been that effective and efficient testing enables frequent delivery of deployable business value. And that's one of the key principles of most Agile methodologies. When I say frequent, I mean being able to deliver an end-to-end feature every iteration, for example. So you might not have enough features to justify releasing the product to your customers, whoever those customers might be. But you might have at least one small feature that with each iteration you can incrementally build upon until you have enough features, end-to-end features, that you can say, yep, okay, that's enough to justify a complete release to our customers. They'll want these new additional features. And when you've got enough of the software, of course, you can do those releases perhaps more frequently, because maybe you want to give your users one new cool little feature every month, for example. So what do I mean by effective and efficient testing? I don't necessarily mean testers being efficient and effective. I mean the testing that happens within the project that everybody does, developers, testers, the customers themselves, can do that effectively and efficiently. Some of the key principles of one methodology, for example, XP, is to automate anything that is repetitive. So if there are tests that you would do repeatedly, if they can be automated, automate them. Some people argue you should aim for 100% automation, and indeed, that's a great thing to aim for. The reality is that that's not always possible, and there are some things that really do need the sort of soft skills or the sort of tacit opinion of an individual, of a human being's eye. But where you can repeat, say for example regression tests, then if it can be automated, that's the best, because we want testers to focus their time on things that require the sort of rapid response of their brain and being able to identify aspects of the software that perhaps you hadn't thought of previously, that with those capabilities you can interact with that software and perhaps find ways in which it could possibly fail when your real customers use it. And often it's hard to script those things. But if you can write it in English, see if it can be also written in code. The tests are used in another way, particularly in test-driven development, for example. They're actually used to do a lot more than just see if the software does what we thought it was supposed to do. So tests are used in XP, particularly in test-driven development, to do a lot more than just evaluate whether the software does what it's supposed to do. It's actually helps to do something a lot more, and that is, for example, you can drive the development of a particular feature with acceptance tests, and unit tests can also be written first. So you write a unit test and a small part of the unit test, and then enough of the code to pass that test, and repeat that iteratively. And these tests are used to actually elicit and clarify the requirements, for example, in the case of acceptance tests. They used to drive and clarify the design in terms of the unit tests. And because they're automated, they enable rapid feedback and therefore, and also allow you to make changes quite quickly and inexpensively. So for each small change, if you can rerun all of your regression tests in a very, very short space of time, that makes it a lot cheaper than if you have to wait 2 weeks for a team of testers to do all of the testing manually. And instead, those testers can focus their efforts in other areas that will be of much, much greater value to the project. So tests are actually that important. Who better to collaborate with on tests than testers? That's our expertise, that's our domain. What do I mean by that? I don't just mean having a testing team somewhere and the developer can pick up the phone or instant message or walk over to them if they're close enough and have a conversation. I mean something more than that. There's one expert in the field, Marcano, who wrote a book on agile estimation and planning, has a slightly different attitude to certain terms, that term in particular being the term developer. And he says that developers refer to all programmers, testers, database engineers, analysts, user interface designers, and so on. What he's trying to get across when he says that is that everybody involved in developing the product he considers to be a developer. And he distinguishes what many people would call a developer in terms of people who write code as programmers. Another person in the industry recently gave a talk at a conference in the US, and in this talk he said, I'm a developer, I develop the product. The person who actually said that was John Bark, and he's a well-recognized software testing expert. He's James Bark's brother, and the two of them are both experts in exploratory testing and jointly invented the concept of session-based testing, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a way of managing exploratory testing in an adaptive way, but still providing the level of documented information that some organizations look for and feel that they don't get with exploratory testing. So the point I think I'm trying to make is that as testers, we are key players in developing the product. If we weren't involved, then there would be, the product wouldn't develop in, would develop in a different way, most likely. So essentially, we are part of the development team. And what I found is that in organizations that try to adopt Agile, and certainly I've worked with quite a few over the past few years, it seems to work best when developers and testers, or if you prefer, programmers and testers, are co-located and collaborate and work together as one single team with a common goal of delivering software. That feeds in nicely to some of the common gotchas, and some of these are mistakes that I've made. Some of them are mistakes that I've seen others make, and I thought I'd share them with you so that perhaps if you are on projects and you're seeing these things, that might give you some ideas as to how you might address them. Or if you are about to start on an Agile team, then you can keep in mind these things so that as you go through the project and perhaps reflect on an iteration, you might remember some of these gotchas and think, well, maybe we can try a different approach. One of the most common gotchas I find for projects, project teams, and companies alike is that there are some common myths relating to Agile software development. When I say software development, I mean all-encompassing, including testing and programming and design and so on. Some of the common myths that are out there can cause significant problems when people are trying to communicate, and they tend to argue over the principles that are held in these myths rather than focusing on what they want to do. So I suggest, educate and develop your skills. Constantly read. There are lots of websites, books, and conferences that you can go to, webinars like this as well, that can help you to dispel some of those myths. And some of the common myths in Agile, among people about Agile projects, is that they lack structure. Well, actually, Agile projects are, in my opinion and in my experience, some of the most structured projects I've ever worked on. Some people say they're undisciplined. Well, they're also the most disciplined projects that I worked on, because by making teams self-organizing, the team has to adopt a certain level of discipline to make sure that they are able to get the job done and deliver working software that their customers actually use. People think that, well, you don't plan in Agile projects. Well, actually, yes, you do. You plan, except instead of planning everything up front, you actually plan a small part at a time. You plan as far into the future as you feel confident you can see. And for some, that tends to be maybe 1 or 2 iterations into the future. For others, less. For others, a little more. Another common myth is that Agile teams lack control. Well, again, relating back to discipline, there are enormous controls on most of the Agile teams that I work on in terms of, one classic example is the practice of continuous integration, where you get notified and the build of the software shows up as red when anyone checks in code or indeed tests that result in a failing test. So there's a huge amount of control there, because whoever checked in that code is then expected to stop what they're doing and go and make sure that they fix the problem they just created. So rather than developing a lot of software over weeks or even months and then letting testers tell you where it's broken and you can't remember, the developer can't remember what they did weeks or days or weeks or months ago, they'll check in the code and they'll be notified instantly of breaking any tests that were potentially repeatable and had been automated. So there's a huge amount of control. People say that there's a lack of design, but again, it's about distributing the design effort over the course of the development. Rather than trying to design everything up front and think of everything up front, you think as far ahead as you know you can see. And this facilitates the ability to adapt to change, because you're not fully committed to a specific architecture, and you architect the software in such a way that it is adaptable and changeable. Sometimes that carries overheads in terms of performance, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. As with anything, sometimes you have to compromise maintainability for performance, and other times you have to compromise performance for maintainability. And in some environments, that's possible, and in other environments, it's not. And skill. Now, skill is one of the key areas in any Agile project, and this is a much rarer myth, but I have actually heard people say that you can get away with being a cowboy in Agile teams much more easily, and I would disagree. I think it becomes much more obvious, certainly in my experience. Another common gotcha, especially for testers, I find, is missing out. And what I mean by that is not being involved in design meetings, not overhearing the conversations and picking up information through osmosis because you're sitting in a centralized testing team, sometimes meters, sometimes miles, sometimes on the other side of the planet. Wherever it is possible, collocate and get involved. And where you can't, try to find other creative solutions. And recently, Elizabeth Richardson wrote about a team that she pair programmed on using online tools that allowed people to see each other's screens and actually interact with each other via the web, including using Skype and an always-on microphone in the background so that everybody could hear the conversations in the two locations. So get involved as much as you can. Get involved in the iteration planning, or as it's called in Scrum, sprint planning. Get involved in the elaboration of user stories into acceptance tests, if that's a practice that's being used in your team. Get involved in prioritization. Be involved in design meetings. You'll be surprised at what you can pick up by seeing what design choices are being made. It makes it much easier to evaluate where you need to focus your effort in terms of testing. Try to learn and understand more about unit tests and how the developers are implementing them. Learn to do even some basic ones yourselves if you haven't done so already. I found that knowing what tests have already been done gives me a deep insight into where the key areas of risk are and where I really need to focus my attention when I'm testing new software. But if there's one thing that I would advise you to get involved in more than anything else, because this is probably the key to everything else in my experience, and that's get involved in retrospectives. If they're not happening frequently, encourage them to happen frequently, ideally every 2 weeks or at the end of every iteration, to look back just on the last iteration and say, what's gone well, what might we do differently in the future? And especially use that as an opportunity to tap into what the pain points are for other members of the team. You know, programmers might be frustrated, oh, we're producing too much code, and I know there's 10 developers for one tester, but we still expect you to test everything. We'll say to them, well, what can you do to help make this problem go away? If they're developers, they write code all the time. Perhaps they can help in the automation effort. If you can't release the software until it's been tested, there's probably no point in building that software. So that's an opportunity to start helping to redistribute some of the workload across the team and feed back to developers and say, or feed back to the rest of the team and say, well, I'm having problems in this area. What can you do to help make this go away? I think retrospectives are really the key place to be involved in any Agile team. And from that, you can help make just about everything else you want to make happen. One thing I'd say, if you are used to working in environments that have quite heavy processes and have huge amounts of documentation, if you are getting involved in Agile teams for the first time, do stop and think about the purpose that document is actually solving. What is its purpose? Because it might be that with the new or additional processes you're adopting, that those purposes are being served elsewhere. And it might simply be a case of educating whoever the audience for those documents is as to the fact that the purpose of the document solving is solved elsewhere. It can be quite scary for some managers if they're used to receiving lots of documents that maybe they don't even have time to read them all, but it makes them feel warm and safe inside when they see all these big, thick documents coming through. But what they're really interested in is the information. So instead, look at how the other elements of the process, the Agile process that you're working within, see how other elements of that process serve the same purpose. Just a couple more to go. Another key gotcha is if you're working on an XP project with using TestDriven Development, bear in mind that the whole idea is that you're trying to identify tests for a user story that the entire team can say, yes, we can commit to building software that will pass all those tests. If we flood the team with too many tests too early on, then sometimes it's just not possible for the team to complete the work in the time. So instead, try to go as fast as the whole team can go. And the whole team is you, the developers, if you have business analysts also, everybody involved in that project, and everybody who ideally is focused on delivering the software. try to avoid measuring progress in bug metrics. The real measure of progress is delivery of working software. If capturing metrics about bugs help you to do that, more effectively, then great. If you want to capture them anyway because it helps you during retrospectives, great. But try not to measure your progress in that regard, because the team, the development team, the testers, the programmers, the project manager, and everybody else involved is there working together to deliver working software, and that's the key underlying value. Another common gotcha, as I found, is that teams try to do all the testing outside the iteration, and they see the work that happens inside the iteration as the stuff the programmers do, and then they release some software outside of the iteration for the testers to do. Well, that's not really providing business value at the end of the iteration, because you then have to wait until the testers have done a round of testing and you can feel confident in the software. So it's about a sustainable pace. Instead, there are ways that you can actually make sure that the software is good enough by the end of the iteration. Now, that might be very hard to achieve if you've got a huge number of programmers and very, very few testers involved in a particular project. But again, take advantage of the iterations to feed this information back. My experience has always been that the team feels much better and produces much more in situations where they are able to be confident that enough testing had been done by the end of the iteration, rather than having to wait another iteration's worth just to get feedback from testers. Another common gotcha is going it alone. Some people will read a book or listen to a webinar and think, okay, we know all about Agile now, let's go and do it. Whatever you do, don't. Because skill and experience are one of the key assets that you will need in being successful in testing and programming and whatever your primary role is on an Agile team. So do find the experience that you need and try to intersperse it across your teams. Try to get people to work as pairs. Cross-pollinate skills and knowledge from programmers to testers, from testers who have experience in Agile teams, or indeed consider coaches to come in periodically and help you move your Agile projects forward. So just to close, what is the role of a tester on an Agile team? Well, I would say is to steer development of the product through expert advice and informative feedback. Expert advice, well, we're experts in testing, so make sure that you really know your art. Continue to develop your skills, continue to read, continue to practice. I spend a huge amount of my spare time just reading up on software testing. I know it might sound sad to some, but I really do love what I do. I really enjoy the feeling of improving and getting better constantly, and it is really a never-ending story. Build a rapport with the rest of your team, with all the testers and developers. I imagine someone might ask, how do you do that? Well, I'll tell you, co-location is such an amazing tool in this regard. I can see someone's got a question, but I'm nearly finished, so if we could just hold on one moment. Do articulate your reasoning. You know, if there is a problem and you say, oh, well, you know, we can't finish this particular part of the work, or, well, if you're going to go down that path, the testing is going to take 3 times as long. Or if you make that design choice, you're going to generate another 15 million different combinations that we could possibly test, and we can't even test a reasonable sample of that in the time. Explain why. People really appreciate that. Never obviously responded, well, just because, or, well, I'm the expert in testing, so just listen to me. Always articulate your reasoning. Get it across as best you can, and in terms that you think that your audience will understand. And do pick your battles. Sometimes it's best to let something go, and especially if you have frequent retrospectives, the cost of letting one thing go in favor of winning another battle is relatively low if you know that you're going to be able to reflect on the experience as a group and see that, well, actually, there is this other problem that we do need to deal with as a team. And that retrospective is an ideal opportunity to do that. So a key facet of the tester's role, in my opinion, is providing informative feedback. Make sure it's timely and topical. The more timely and topical it is, the better. If you're testing something that was built just hours ago or just yesterday, that's much more useful than when providing feedback on or bug reports. So feedback could be in the form of bug reports, it could be in the form of a conversation or a query. But it's much more useful to provide that feedback very, very soon after the software was actually, that part of the code was actually written. And that's what I was talking about in terms of being able to test inside the iteration and make sure the software, the team collectively is confident the software is good enough by the end of the iteration. Do communicate and collaborate, face-to-face conversations. If you can, walk over and speak to somebody, then do. Don't send an email. So many things get lost in the translation in emails, I found. And do use the tools at your disposal. But bear in mind, not all tools are designed to work with Agile projects. Many commercial testing tools, for example, I found are designed to solve the problem of a team that is completely independent and not even co-located with the development team. Or to solve the problem of the fact that you can't influence the development team to use a particular naming convention in their GUI objects, for example. And in a lot of environments where I've worked on Agile teams, that just isn't a problem. And we ended up actually just using the programming language that the developers were most comfortable with, because that allowed everybody to contribute to test automation, for example. And finally, really do focus what is of the most value to the project in terms of your feedback. And that goes without saying. And some people use a risk-based approach to determine that, and some people use simply their gut feel. I'm not recommending any particular approach, but when you do provide feedback, really do, in terms of how you communicate it, focus on the value to the project or the value to the individual. Not so much on the fact that it's a bug and it's bad. And the one last bit of advice is really focus on collaboration. Do become a part of the team. Developers, testers, all working together. In my experience, focusing is much better. Everyone focusing on a single common goal, and that is delivering working software. Not one group intended on writing code and another group intended on finding bugs, but everyone working collaboratively to deliver working software. And thank you very much for listening to me.